Okay, so what's next in your story?
Let's see. So I think, I think I'll move to when I met my husband. So I actually met my husband in high school. Yeah, we were good friends. We met through marching band, which is just so romantic.
A little nerdy.
So, a little nerdy, but hey, I mean, yeah. So
I'm kidding.
it's fine. No, actually, I'll be honest. The only reason I joined marching band was because our marching band was going to Disneyland that year, and I wanted to go to Disneyland, so I joined. I ended up staying with it because I actually really enjoyed it. But so I was on the color guard. So I spun the flags and the rifles and stuff like that. It was fun. I loved it. I had great friends who did it with me. And then John, my husband, who he was also in marching band. He played the flute. And he actually, it's so funny. He joined the flute section because mainly it was girls who were in the flute section. And so he's like, hey, good odds for me.
Yeah.
So,
rascal,
yeah.
little rascal.
Anyways. So yeah, that's how we met. And so we actually started dating when we were both 17 in high school. We dated for a full 3 years before we got married, which I actually am very, very glad. I'm not the type of person who can meet someone and then get married very quickly after that. I need to be very, very thoughtful in the decisions I make. And so I needed that time to get to know him really well and make sure our relationship was strong in that regard. But yeah, dating definitely presented some very interesting concerns with scrupulosity.
Because Mormons are taught what about any romantic behaviors before marriage?
Yeah, so as might be apparent, I struggled a lot with not actually breaking the law of chastity, but of being afraid of the law of chastity. And okay, I will say that I don't think the church discourages relationships and stuff like that. So I won't go as far as to say that or anything. It's just there is a pretty high standard of the rules you have to follow in regard to that, in regard to dating. When it comes to things like that. Yeah, so I don't know.
And so you're dating,
Yeah.
and normally kids would hold hands, or maybe they would kiss, or maybe they would hug, or even make out. Mm-hmm. What's that like for a Mormon teen girl in Rexburg, Idaho, who's got scrupulosity?
Yeah, I'll say it took up a lot of years of my life kind of dealing with implications from this. So we were a normal teenage couple. We didn't, looking back actually, and John, while we were dating, I mean, tried to convey this to me all the time, that we did not break the law of chastity. We've read the Strength of Youth pamphlet all the time, over and over and over again, just to make sure. This is where my hyper confessing came in, confessing of sins. And I'd mentioned previously that for someone with OCD, we can almost convince ourselves that we committed a sin when we actually have not, or not. That's in a religious context. We can convince ourselves that we have done a certain action when in fact we haven't. And I know that might sound strange, but that's actually, I mean, that's how it works for some people. So I would have, John and I mean, we'd be, together and stuff, and I'd have what you'd call, I guess, maybe impure thoughts come into my head or something. And, I became so devastated about my standing before God and my worthiness. I was so ashamed to even go to church and to At this time, I withdrew so much from my parents because I was so ashamed of the mistakes that I thought I had made. And granted, yeah, of course, we all make mistakes and whatever. I'm not saying I was 100% perfect in what I did, but it was taken to such an extreme that like the guilt was, I can't even explain the level I felt during this time. So
are you able to share with us the types of thoughts? Is it just like he's cute, or oh, I'm really attracted to him, or oh, I want to kiss him, or is it start having sexual thoughts? Like,
yeah, kind of a mix of all of those. I mean, as any relationship progresses, of course, it started out with like the more like, oh, like I'm attracted to him or whatever, and then as it progresses, it does start to delve into sexual thoughts, which I think is just natural. And, my parents were always very good about teaching us that, like, as a human, you're gonna have thoughts. It's what we do based on those thoughts that are important. We have control over that. But yeah, for me, it was those thoughts that were my actual reality. And it was so hard to separate myself from the thoughts versus the actions. And so if I had any type of thought, I had sinned. And so I would confess that to my bishop. I would withdraw from my parents because I was so ashamed of it. And yeah, it just created a very interesting scenario for sure.
So you were confessing a lot to your church leaders and to your parents, but you weren't actually acting in any really explicit way on your sexuality, just to be clear, right?
Yeah. Yep. I mean, the farthest we ever went was, we would make out, but that's a normal teenager thing to do. And but yeah, strictly speaking, within the church guidelines, we were very much in line with those. And so it's been interesting to me to look back at that from this perspective after I've come to realize what I deal with and kind of say, actually, I didn't do anything I should be ashamed of. And I'm not saying that if you do those things, you should be ashamed. Like, not at all. That's not what I'm saying.
Yeah.
Just from my perspective back then.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, super hard.
Yeah.
Okay, so more torment around that. And if anyone wants to go back and listen to the first episode we did on scrupulosity, that's a case of hyper confessing. And maybe something just psychoeducationally that's worth noting here. If somebody has scrupulosity and they're hyper confessing, there's nothing you can do to reassure them that they're okay. Even if in the case of a bishop saying, I talked to God myself and he says you're okay, tell me how that gets processed by someone with scrupulosity, Anna.
Yeah, there's no convincing someone with scrupulosity that they are okay before the Lord. Because what happens when your bishop will tell you that I've prayed, the Lord has told me, like, you're forgiven and stuff like that. While that might reassure other people, the thought that immediately pops into your head was, well, then I didn't confess everything that I needed.
Right. Maybe
I
forgot to mention something.
Yeah, I forgot to mention something then. That must be it. And also, another scripture that I just had a hard time with in this regard was that it is by grace that you are saved after all you can do. And so, yeah, so that all you can do part was...
Have I done all I could do?
Yeah, no. So there was just no convincing me that I was okay. And in fact, okay, so this is kind of interesting too. So during that time, I was really, really, really worried about my own worthiness. I started to look for essentially signs that I was forgiven. So I would say, like, okay, God, if I'm forgiven, like, make this happen in my life or something like that. And of course that didn't always happen. But sometimes it did. And it would reinforce this thought process. So one quick example, and again, it might seem a little bit silly, but to me, it was it felt like a life or death situation. Okay, so in college and through high school, I danced. I did clog dancing and ballroom dancing, and this was my freshman year of college, and I again was just beating myself up over these sins that I had convinced myself I had committed, and I had recently lost my clogging shoes. So I was like, okay, if I'm forgiven, like, help me find my clogging shoes right now, and then I would find them just throughout the course of looking. And I would try to just hang on to anything I could as evidence that I'd been forgiven. And that would reassure me for a second, but then I'd come up with all of these other tests and things I had to do in order to be forgiven. And it just ended up taking up a lot of my time and a lot of effort in that regard. And still it wasn't enough to convince myself.
And that will eventually we'll get to the treatment of OCD, but as long as you're performing compulsions, you're actually maintaining or making worse your OCD. Yeah. So this is where it gets tricky, is if you're a parent or a bishop and your kid or someone is hyper confessing to you and you're continually offering reassurance, what you're actually doing is reinforcing and strengthening their OCD because you're participating in their compulsive behavior. And so this is where relationships with other people can get really tricky, because obviously the last thing you want to do is make someone's OCD worse. But when you get caught up in trying to reassure, you are literally enabling and strengthening the compulsions.
Yeah, no, I agree with that, because how your brain starts to make these connections is that you do these compulsions and then everything turns out to be okay, right? Like life goes on as normal. And then you start thinking, oh, well, that's because I did this certain act or, did that a certain way. And then when other people are reassuring you that you had done something good by doing what might be a compulsion, it does reinforce that cycle, and it really becomes ingrained into your mind that it's because of those compulsions or those acts that you're doing that results are panning out the way that they do. So
right, and if people don't know how OCD works, they would have no idea that they were actually strengthening the problem.
Yeah, no, it's interesting, and it's hard to navigate that because for like I said, no one knew that I had OCD until just a couple of years ago. And so, and even people, like if people have OCD, it's so hard to draw that line between maybe giving a compliment to someone, what you might think you're just making a compliment, where it could really just be an enforcement of a vicious cycle. So It's very challenging.
Yeah.
So.
Okay, so we've got the hyper confessing adding to your story. What comes next?
Oh my goodness. Okay. Well, I mean, there are, of course, just a lot of things. So John served a mission. So he was, he's only 5 months older than me, but he was a grade older than me in school. So during my senior year of high school, he left on his mission. So he went to Baltimore, Maryland. Had a good time for the most part. He ended up coming home early. So he was there for 9 months, came home early due to depression and anxiety. And he had some stomach problems as well. And it turns out he had developed a major ulcer from all the anxiety and stress he was under. And we actually laugh because a couple of years ago, I think it was, I can't remember the talk, but I think it was Elder Holland or something gave a talk. I think it was Be Ye Therefore Perfect Eventually or something like that. Mm-hmm. And in it, he actually talked about, do the best that you can, but don't put so much pressure on yourself that you give yourself an ulcer. And we just laugh because that's exactly what happened with John on his mission. And, so anyways, just kind of funny. So yeah, that's another thing. We both deal with a lot of different mental health problems. But so for me, it was hard when he came home early from his mission. It was very challenging because I was of this perspective, of course, that you serve a full-time 2-year mission, no matter what. And so it was really, it took me a while to get over that fear a little bit of what would happen if I stayed with him now.
Like, is he worthy? Is he worthy?
Is he worthy?
Righteous enough?
Exactly.
Because he didn't do the full mission.
Exactly. Yeah. And, because you hear all the time that I think, especially young women in the church here, that you want to strive to marry a returned missionary. Like that's the thing. And I will say that I think in the last couple years, the culture around that in Rexburg has changed a little bit. It's becoming a lot more accepting of missionaries who return home early. But it was not when John came home. When John came home, and that was 6 years ago now, something like that, it was very, very different. He did not get an opportunity to give a homecoming speech. He'd have people asking him, okay, well, when are you going back out? Things like that, where he couldn't go back out because he and he said he's okay with me sharing this, but he got to the point where he became suicidal on his mission, and it just was not mentally healthy for him to be there anymore. And I hate to say that I was kind of contributing to that a little bit out of my own fear, saying, hey, when are you going back out? And of course, my family as well kept saying, is he going back out? Is he going back out? Everyone around us kept saying that, including myself. So, and again, it had to do with this this OCD mentality as well, like you were saying, just making sure he was worthy, and because I was going to be committed to this for the rest of my life, of course. And what impact would that have then on our future children if he didn't serve a full-time mission? So I don't just think about those immediate, I guess, ramifications from it. My whole life is out there at this point.
Mormon kids are, or at least when I was growing up, were told the most important decisions you'll ever make are who you marry and when and where you marry them. Basically, you marry a righteous person in a temple as soon as you get off your mission. And that's it. That's the decision of your life, right?
Yes. Yeah. It is. Yeah. It is. And I struggled with this because him and I just had those people where you meet and you just have an instant connection and you just vibe on every level. That was him and I. We met and became great friends. We are just perfect, super, super compatible with each other. People tell us all the time that we're just, we still, I've had friends in law school tell me that we still seem like a brand, a newly married couple, even though we've been married 4 years now. And it's just fun. We have fun together. But so I was struggling with that, feeling like that. And also but I don't know if he's worthy. So
right.
It was really hard.
Which is exacerbating your scrupulosity and his depression and anxiety.
Yes. Oh my God. Yeah, we've come, of course, a long way since then. And I actually feel like we complement each other really well now. I feel like being in a relationship where both people struggle with mental illness to the extent that we do, there can be some challenges there for sure. But I also think there's a lot of groundwork there for you to have empathy for each other. And so over the last several years we've been together, we've just really grown in that area. And that's been great for us. But yeah, back then, for sure, we were trying to navigate that.
Okay. So what'd you do? Yes.
Yeah. So it's not that simple as just what did you do? But yeah, no, it took up so that at the time he came home, I was just starting my freshman year of college, I believe. And so I was trying to get used to that, get used to college life. I went to BYU-Idaho. And also he came home. And so since I went to school in the town where I grew up, and that's where he grew up as well, we were still together. We didn't have to do any more long distance, anything like that. Yeah. And I will say, like, and this is without assigning blame to anyone. It was an understandably hard situation. My family and I went through a really hard time during that. And regard to him coming home early from his mission. You know, as parents, you want nothing but the best for your children, of course. And I had always emphasized that, I am going to marry a returned missionary and things like that. Like, it was more a little bit fear-based than it was, actually wanting that, as I look back now. And so, my parents would see this and be like, you say you want this, like, I don't know. So there's a lot of things there, of course, that were difficult for us to navigate during that time. We got through it. I mean, we all kind of realized that, John was a perfectly worthy person. And like I said, my parents were very, very good about honoring the spirit of the law. And so they got to the point too where it's like, you know what, it doesn't matter. And it's fine. And actually, my dad just got released from being a bishop at BYU-Idaho, and he did such a great job. And like, I didn't think he wouldn't or anything, of course, but like, he would tell me actually several times that because of this experience we went through as a family with John coming home early, he has been much more open and empathic to those at BYU-Idaho who struggle both with their faith or with going on a mission or things like that. And so as I look back, it was a hard experience, but I think ultimately it was worth it because a lot of good has come from it since then. So,
sure.
And, yeah, that's something my family and I talk about a lot. And yeah.
Good for Dad.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it's been great. So yeah, so that would, and I won't go into like a lot of detail about what happened during that time or anything. But I will say that it got to the point where for the first time I did develop suicidal thoughts, and it was very, very, very difficult. So I'm not skipping over this because it's not important. I just, for now, I don't want to necessarily go into all of the detail surrounding that event, if that's okay.
That's great. But, yeah, of course.
Yeah.
Of course.
So, yeah. No, so it got to the point where, and for me too, I wanted to have a good relationship with my family and with his family going forward. And so that was very, very important to me. And eventually we all got to the point where we kind of grew together as a family. We overcame something really, really difficult for all of us. And John and I have been happily married for 4 years, and we have since just had so much fun with my family and with his family. And yeah, we're all great. We've come to such a good place with all of that. So
that's great. So happy to hear.
Yeah.
So is it worth talking about at what point you learned about what scrupulosity was and maybe even sought treatment for it? And then if so, what that treatment was like and how you got better?
Sure. So there are a few more things about.
Oh yeah, please.
Yeah, no, it's okay. Would you rather me talk about that or
No, go in the timeline. Follow the chronology. Okay. Yeah.
Okay, for sure. Yeah, because it was about I'd say a year and a half after we were married that I received my diagnosis and got help for it.
Okay.
Yeah, so I had an interesting time, of course, going through the temple for the first time. That was the period when John and I were engaged, where I had the most panic attacks and the most fear of staying worthy. And the hyper confessing, of course, because I wanted to make sure that we could get married in the temple, and that if we were going to get married in the temple, it was like I had to be 100% worthy. And so that was the point where I was talking about earlier, where I had 4 to 5 panic attacks per week. And this is while I'm in school. I'm working part-time, planning a wedding, and having that many panic attacks every single week. And it drains your energy, let me just say.
Yeah.
So, so I had, my temple recommend interviews. That was just so frightening for me. All these experiences where, like, looking back, there are so many experiences growing up in the church that people often say they had such joyful experiences with, and such a profound experience, and they felt feelings of peace. I was the opposite. It was almost like a traumatic experience for me. So anyways, we ended up like getting our recommends. It took a lot of convincing, but my bishop and stake president assured me that I was completely worthy.
Not you convincing them convincing you.
No, them convincing me, yes. So, and I was very honest and open about everything, and they're like, you're fine, you're okay. Yeah. So, but it was hard. That was a very dark time for me, which, is sad, because when you're engaged, you're, planning your life together with this other person, and it should be a time for celebration and joy. And granted, there was some of that as well. I'm not saying it was all completely miserable, of course, but there was always that thing in the back of my mind that kind of dampened the situation quite a bit. And so, do we want to talk about my experience going through the temple for the first time?
Yeah, please.
Okay. So, this is very interesting. So, a little bit of backstory to this. By the time I was 15 or 16, I'd kind of become a closeted feminist, and that was scary to me. So, so backdrop to that as well. So no one had ever told me necessarily that I couldn't pursue a career or do anything like that. But because it was so black and white, I relied on church teachings that said, your place is in the home raising children, and, that's what you have to do. So I felt so guilty for having these desires to pursue a career. And so that was another thing that was really hard for me to deal with, thinking that I am somehow imperfect or needed to repent for wanting to, pursue education and for having a career. So that was another thing that was really hard for me.
Sure.
Yeah. So all that aside, I went through the temple, and I had relied on this teaching that I had always at least felt that I had a personal connection to God, that I had direct access to God. And then I go through the temple, and to me, the language is such that I now have to go through my husband to get to God. And for me, that was just devastating, because I had worked so hard to be worthy of that. And to get the blessings from making these covenants and for, deepening that relationship with God. And I had a hard time with the covenants that I, as a female in the church, had to make to my husband.
So, and whenever you talk about the temple within Mormon context, there's always going to be high levels of sensitivity, but I'll just say it if you don't want to, that
yeah, go ahead.
In Mormonism, there's a history of inequality in terms of what the man promises in covenants and what the woman promises in covenants in the temple. Historically, the man makes his covenants with God, and the woman sort of makes her covenants with the man, or promises not to obey God, but promises to kind of hearken or obey the man. And then there's other inequalities like, you get a new name in the temple and the woman can tell the man her new name, but the man doesn't tell the woman his new name. Mm-hmm. Tell me, those are some of the types of things. And the woman veils her face and the man doesn't. So those are some of the types, and I'm only saying that so you don't feel like you have to talk in detail if you don't want to.
Yeah.
Is there anything else you want to add, or are those the types of things that bothered you?
No, that about covers it. And I do appreciate that because just out of, I don't know, and which is fine. I don't necessarily feel comfortable about talking about details or anything. So I do appreciate that. So, but yeah, it was things like that that made me feel very, very confused about the situation, to say the least. And then aside from the feminism aspect from it, I didn't know what covenants I was going to be making at the time when I went through the temple, and for me that was a huge deal, because if you remember the process I went through getting baptized when I was 8 and wanting to be very, very aware of the promises I was making and being very conscientious about that choice. Going through the temple was hard because you aren't allowed to talk about the details outside of it. And so I was going in not having any idea what I was committing myself to necessarily. And that was a very, very scary thing for me. And I struggled after going through the temple because I couldn't remember what all of those covenants were, because it's a lot to remember for your first time going through. But because I couldn't fully remember and I couldn't talk about it with anyone, I just became so frightened that I was breaking these covenants now. And, and along with that, so wearing garments was another very, very interesting thing for me as well with scrupulosity. So it got to this point where I wore my garments for about 2 years after we got married. But it was kind of on and off, because I would go through these times where I felt as though I was breaking my covenants or I was unworthy. Again, with those intrusive thoughts and everything, thinking that I had sinned. And so I felt like I wasn't worthy to wear my garments. But then that creates the problem that I had covenanted to wear my garments. and so I was faced with this constant confusion about, should I wear them or shouldn't I wear them? There was no way for me to perfectly keep all of the covenants in my mind, if that made sense.
Yeah, it's a catch-22. You have to be worthy to wear your garments.
Yeah.
But you're unworthy if you don't wear your garments.
Yes, exactly. So I had some big problems with that, of course. And that took up a lot of my time and energy and attention after I got married. And so, yeah, very interesting. I will say after getting married, going through the temple the first time, I only went back through about 4 more times after that, just because it was a very, very big ordeal for me. It was, again, it was those worthiness issues and things like that.
And again, it's not like you're you're doing drugs and sleeping around with
No.
outside your marriage. Again, it's just the
No.
torment of perfectionism.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's a good clarification. So when I say that, it doesn't mean that I actually was sinning according to church standards, but in my brain, I had convinced myself that I was.
Right.
So again, just keep that in mind. So.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's super hard because then the temple is one of the most important things, but then the temple can become traumatic and triggering. But then you hear messages at church all day that you got to go to the temple and wear your garments. Yep. And that's just a real heavy catch-22 and an additional psychological burden for you.
And for very, very exhausting.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, it was for sure. It was hard. We spent many, many days and nights with John and I having these discussions about worthiness and just about things like that. And yeah, it was very, very interesting. So.
Yeah, and marriage can be hard enough. And then if your spouse thinks, why aren't you going to the temple? Why aren't you comfortable with the temple? Mm-hmm. Then it can add marital conflict because you're not being righteous like you should be.
Right.
And it can just compound the complexity of the marriage.
Yeah, and I will say actually, I'm seriously so grateful for John. He actually was never like that. So I know that it can turn into that sometimes. He the way I describe him is we learn about this concept of Christ-like love or charity, which I've always just thought beautiful about the church and about the scriptures. And I feel like John, my husband, just embodies that so perfectly well. He just, great person. I love him to death. Anyone who knows John just can probably affirm that as well. So great guy. But it created the problem where I would think that he was thinking that about me. And it turned into this, me kind of constantly interrogating him about how he felt about it, things like that. So, again, a vicious cycle.
Yeah. Okay. So difficult temple experiences.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very, very, very difficult. And I know, in some ways, scrupulosity presents in people to where they're going to the temple all the time. And I did that. I read my scriptures a lot, and I hyper confessed, things like that. So it did present in that way for me a little bit. But in regard to the temple, I think the compulsion I did was avoidance. And some people don't realize that avoidance is actually a compulsion in OCD.
Yeah. Yep.
So.
And it's one of the worst because you avoid something thinking you're going to not have it in your life, but the act of avoiding it makes it that it's constantly on your mind because you have to have it on your mind to avoid it. So avoidance becomes torment. Is that right?
It is. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And in addition to the temple, that's a major one of mine. Avoidance has been a big thing for me that I've had to overcome, and I'm still working on that. Mental health is a long journey, and it's a never ending journey. But yeah, it's something that you can definitely work on, and it can improve. If anything, I think I'm proof of that. So
yeah. That's great.
Yeah.
Yeah. So avoiding, that's a classic scrupulosity affliction.
Yeah, it is.
So what comes next?
Well, so maybe this might be a good time to talk about, because the other part of my story too is me dealing with my feminism and how that kind of plays into, it does play into my scrupulosity a little bit, because as I mentioned before, I felt like the church taught you can't do that. And that's not necessarily true. But the overwhelming feeling that I got was that I only had one choice, if that makes sense. And that was to stay home and raise children and, everything like that.
Yeah, I think it's fair to say that the church, there are working women in the church, and the church doesn't now in 2020 20 like explicitly openly condemn a career professional women, but so much of what's focused on and emphasized and taught and encouraged to young women are that they be stay-at-home moms. And so even if the church isn't, but then you can also have local leaders that do explicitly condemn working moms. So talk about that if you want.
Yeah. So, okay, I do have an interesting story. So I appreciate that you said that it's the rare exception where people in the church actually go out of their way to say, you can't do this, so I do have an example of that if you want to hear it.
Sure, yeah.
It's actually very interesting. So during my freshman year of high school, I was in seminary. We were studying the Doctrine and Covenants that year. And so this seminary teacher of mine, and this didn't happen to me directly, but it happened to someone in my class, and I was there to witness it. We did this activity where we write down our goals for the future, and what we're looking for in a future spouse, what we view our family looking like in the future. So what happens is there's a question on there saying, how many kids do you want? Or how many kids do you see yourself having? And my seminary teacher actually walks past one of my friends, or a girl in my class, and picks up her paper and tells the class, okay, women, I want to make something very, very clear. So this person has said that they only want two children on their paper. And, your role as a woman is to have as many kids as you can. And if the only reason you want two children is because you you're planning on going out to work, then you need to readjust your priorities. You need to, change that. And he made a major deal out of it. And then he made comments about how children who grow up in a home where the mother worked will struggle in all areas of their life as adults. And then, of course, we have so many kids in the class who have working moms who then are like, okay, like, what does that say about me? And of course, lots of women who are wanting to pursue careers. And so that's my only real example of someone who's outright told me that I can't do that. So very interesting.
And then there's just the cultural, what you see in your home ward and what the church models when they hold up, women leaders. Yep. And it's just always the stay-at-home mom. So,
yep.
So you will grow up. You would have grown up, especially in Rexburg, with this idea that you should be a stay-at-home mom, and that wasn't what you were wanting inside.
Exactly. And yeah, I forgot where I was going for a second with that, but remind me one more time.
No, just feminism. And I don't know if you were trying to start talking about your faith crisis, maybe as a parallel stream to your scrupulosity journey.
Yeah. One thing I wanted to make clear as well, is that, so some people, I think, especially in the church, view people who have, like me, who have opinions of like, I want to be able to have the choice to go work. I want to do that. That doesn't mean that I think that staying home is a bad choice. I think it's a great choice. But the problem that a lot of people in the church, or a lot of women in the church face, is thinking that that's their only option, So I talk with my mom a lot, and she is a nurse, so she has her nursing degree. But she always told me that she was so grateful that she had the choice to stay home and raise kids, and she's done a fantastic job with that. And I was like, wow, that's so awesome that you got to make that choice. But I feel like the harm in the church's overall view towards that is the only choice that women have, and that if you do choose to have a career, it's like a second class thing. It's like, great, you can choose that, but that's really pretty sad. You're missing out on what you should be doing. So,
right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Anyways.
So tell us how these early feminist inklings sort of progressed for you over time.
Yeah, sure. So I think got to its peak point after I went through the temple, and after I had been married for about a year or so. So this is another part where that the interview you did with the Nielsen's, I just related to so much, because we had such a hard time with like the roles that we were supposed to be doing in our marriage. And like they had mentioned that several times, and what they said about that just really resonated with me, because we had a problem with that too. So for instance, John isn't the type of person to like be the natural leader. It's just not natural for him to say like, okay, we're doing family scripture study, this is how things are going to be, things like that. But I felt like he had to do that as the priesthood holder in our home. And so I initially would get frustrated with him, saying like, I shouldn't be having to do this because that's your job as a man and as a priesthood holder, and things like that. And initially he felt pressure. So John he does not like school. So he has his bachelor's degree, but just school is not his thing. And so he felt pressure from society and culture, whatever you will, to pursue a master's degree and to do all this stuff with education, and just so he could be the provider for us and things like that. And that was not what he wanted to do with his life. And he felt so much pressure in his role, as the leader to do that. And so that was really harmful for him. And then, for me, again, just, it was kind of the opposite, of course. Like I feel like out of the two of us, I feel like I have the more leadership type personality, if that makes sense. And so for me, it was really hard that if I, for instance, would like assert myself and say, hey, I'm planning like a family home meeting or something, I felt so guilty because that wasn't my role. That was not what I was supposed to be doing. And so for like a good year or so, we had such a hard time with navigating that dynamic. We finally kind of came to the point where we realized that, roles within a marriage, at least for our marriage, wasn't going to be based on our gender. It was going to be based on who we were as people. And after we made that decision, it relieved a lot of stress for us. So,
nice.
Yeah. And then, so for instance, we got to the point actually where something that's always just bothered me a little bit is how you go to a large gathering and a guy will get up and say, okay, as head of the household, I'm going to ask you to say the prayer, or things like that. Home teachers would come over and say, hey, this is your home. Would you like to say the prayer, to my husband and ever to me, And so we got to the point where we would switch off, asking people if they would pray, and taking over leadership responsibilities like that. And this is actually really interesting. So we didn't think it was that big of a deal or anything. It helped me feel a little bit better about my importance in the marriage and in the church, and it helped John feel better about not feeling pressure to have to take the lead all the time and things like that. So it worked really well for us. So we did have an experience where we had moved into a brand new ward, and the elders quorum president came over to just chat with us, get to know us a little bit. Great times. It went great. I loved that ward, actually. It was a great place to be. But at the end, well, actually, so at the beginning, he asked John to say, like, hey, who do you want to say the prayer? This is your home. So John's like, okay, Hannah, do you want to say the prayer or something? So I said a prayer. And then at the end, it was getting apparent that like the meeting was kind of over. And so I said, all right, so brother so-and-so, would you like to offer us a closing prayer? And he was so confused. He said, wait, no, he demands. And he used those words. He said, he demands, in regard to my husband. And, I told him, this is just as much my home as it is his home. And, this is what works for us as a couple. And it's more my home than it is your home. And so I would love it if you'd be willing to say the prayer. And so, and so he said the prayer, and then he, of course, made comments about how, oh, well, you think you're the man or whatever, just joking. And I'm like, no, I'm not. I'm clearly not a man, but So, just a few interesting things like that kind of rubbed me the wrong way a little bit. And that's fine. I mean, it is how it is. But.
I mean, it's worth saying that the Mormonism is kind of another F word within Mormon culture. When Kate Kelly and other feminists, the September 6th, whenever women have really tried to, or the ERA, whenever women have tried to express feminist inklings or thoughts or feelings, for decades and decades and decades, they've been slapped down and excommunicated. Mm-hmm. And so just in the past few years, with all the backlash from Kate Kelly and her excommunication, and all the global press, the church has started to try and elevate some soft feminists like Nyland McClain and others to kind of make us look not so severely patriarchal and anti-feminist, but within the rank and file of the church, feminism is a bad word, and you don't want to self-identify as a feminist. Certainly men don't do that, and that would make it so within the culture, no man or few men would ever be interested in even learning about the tenets of feminism or supporting them or becoming sensitive to feminist sensibilities. And so I that's the cultural milieu that we're all swimming in, is sort of an anti-feminist culture.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I will say that I'm actually really hopeful for the steps that the church is taking in kind of mitigating this a little bit. And in the future going forward, I can see, in my opinion, I think it's going in a positive direction. Yep. So I'm grateful for that. But no, you're right. So when ordained women was going on, I was struggling. That was the point where I was struggling mostly with, I felt like I was a feminist, and that was really scary to me. So I did everything I could to say how harmful ordained women was, and how, you kind of go to the extreme on the other side to make sure people don't realize you secretly kind of agree with it a little bit. So that's where I was about during that time. So
sure. Yeah. Okay. So what comes next in your story?
So I decided, before I had my faith crisis actually fully hit, I did make the decision that I was going to pursue a law degree. Again, I need to just shout out to my husband again, because he's the one who helps me reason through those thoughts and feel confident about my decision to do that. And was so encouraging, because I know this is not the case with most people, but there are some men that I have met that if I were to be in a relationship with them, they would not have encouraged me to do that or move to Virginia with me so I could pursue that degree and get that education. So I just am so grateful to him and for all that he did in helping me get to that point.
So as a believing Mormon, he was still willing to be supportive of your desire to go to graduate school to pursue a law profession.
Yeah, he really was. Because it'd been on the back of my mind for several years, and I would just tell him, I wish I could just do this. I feel like it would be a good use of like my talents and my interests and abilities and skills, and he'd be like, so why don't you? He was the one to encourage me to do that, and I just am very, very, very grateful to that. He helped a lot in me allowing myself to change my perspectives and thoughts around feminism and the church and my choices regarding that. So
shout out to John. Thumbs up to John.
Yep, he's awesome. So so then so I'm trying to figure out how I want to talk about my faith crisis a little bit, because I feel like it's a little bit different than what other people experience, because it was so tied in with my OCD, rather than just church history issues and things like that.
Yeah. That's great. So, I love, people being able to tell different types of stories.
Yeah. So around this time as well, so about a year after I got married, I started seeing a therapist for my depression and anxiety. I had no idea that I dealt with scrupulosity or OCD at this time, but I knew that I needed some help. So that's where I was. I started going to therapy about a year. It took about a year actually of therapy to get my diagnosis of OCD and scrupulosity, which is just partly because I had trouble disclosing my thoughts and things like that, because I knew that these thoughts and feelings I had were, a little bit abnormal, but then I was so scared of the response to those, even though that's a therapist's job, right? So it took me a while to get that diagnosis.
So what made you, when you originally went to a therapist, how did you conceptualize yourself as needing therapy?
Yeah, it was mainly these panic attacks I kept having.
Panic attack.
Yeah, and that had been going on for a couple years, but it had gotten to the point where it was getting getting worse and worse instead of getting better.
Yeah.
And so I was finally just like, you know what, I need some help for this. I need to try something that I haven't tried before. So yeah.
And one of the good news about anxiety disorders like panic attacks or OCD is that they're highly treatable. Phobias, panic, agoraphobia, and of course OCD, they are all highly treatable with empirically supported evidence-based treatments if you'll just seek treatment. But they often don't resolve themselves without treatment. So right. It's literally needless suffering for many people the longer they wait or if they don't go.
Yeah, I fully agree with that. And again, sometimes you don't often realize what the underlying problem was.
Yeah. Yep.
So I thought I was dealing with, maybe a generalized anxiety disorder, which I do deal with as well, but there's a lot more to it than that, which I had come to find out and have done a lot of work on and everything. So yeah, I got treatment for that. I was in therapy for about 3 years in regard to that. So right up until I left and moved to Virginia, I had been working through my scrupulosity and OCD and depression issues, with this therapist in Rexburg. And I feel like I actually got to a really pretty good point with that. So where I'm in school now, I still deal with these problems a little bit. What was
his treatment? If you don't mind saying, what was his treatment? Was he aware of what scrupulosity was?
Yes.
Was he competent with OCD treatment? And what was the treatment?
Yeah. A lot of cognitive behavioral therapy treatment, and just a lot of just talk therapy in general. So for me, just knowing what my diagnosis was and learning about it helped so much. I can't even explain it. But as soon as I became aware of what this was and what I had been dealing with for so long, it immediately kind of relieved some of this pain I'd been carrying around. Knowing that other people have gone through this as well, and that there are treatments for it. And so I would say that something, I guess, really critical to treatment is to actually learn about what you're dealing with. It's scientific. It's not that there's anything wrong with you. And that's what I thought was so interesting. And so, yeah, that and CBT a little bit were definitely very helpful for me.
So did this therapist recognize the scrupulosity right off, or did it take him a while, or did you have other therapists first who weren't aware of it? How did you said the scrupulosity diagnosis didn't come immediately, right?
Right. So,
partly because you weren't
yes.
talking about the thoughts.
So the interesting thing is, so I had started talking about like a lot of my anxiety related to church, and then, so that went on for several weeks. And I should note too, that this therapist is active LDS, everything like that. It was great. So yes, even in Rexburg, you can find good treatment for mental health, but so I started having these, talking about my anxiety related to church things. And he asked several follow-up questions about how I perceived, promptings from the Holy Ghost, for instance, how I perceived different aspects of the religion. And so I told him about all of these experiences that I've shared on here. And, we figured out that I have scrupulosity and I have other forms of OCD as well. And as soon as we made that realization, I feel like I was able to do a lot of work really quickly in regard to it. So yeah, he was able to see it, able to see how church culture can be harmful to someone with mental disorders like that, and was very effective in treating it. So
kudos to him, because if a therapist either doesn't know about it, or worse, they try and treat the scrupulosity with what is often just your gut instinct or logic or common sense, a therapist can often make the scrupulosity worse, let alone making it better. And you'll get these therapists that mix their religious values with their therapy treatment, and they're like reassuring you or telling you to pray more, or telling you to seek help from Jesus, or teaching you about Jesus and the atonement and read your scriptures more, and trying to talk to you about doctrine and theology. And it's just all going to make it worse.
Sure. Yeah, no, and that's what I was a little bit afraid of as well, because I had heard stories like that from several friends of mine. And like we were talking about earlier, things like that can just really reinforce it if you're being told to read your scriptures a certain way or a certain amount of times or things like that. And unfortunately, I have heard a lot of stories of people going through that in Rexburg. That's not everyone's experience, but I was afraid that would be the case with me as well. And
then again, if they're reassuring, that also can contribute to the problem. In the episode I did a few years ago, we would have a bishop that would give him a prayer saying he's forgiven, and then write down the prayer and transcribe it, thinking that, if he had the transcription of the prayer, then that's going to help him not feel so guilty. And again, all of that is just feeding into the compulsion to the need to get resolution. And
absolutely.
So that's not helpful either.
So Okay, another resource I wanted to mention as well, and it's so random how I got this. My mother-in-law happened to have this book randomly just lying around, and this is after I got my diagnosis and was kind of working through it. But I have it right here. It's called The OCD Mormon, if you can see it.
Oh, wow. Never heard of that.
Yeah. I hadn't either. And, but yeah, it talks about this woman's experience with dealing with scrupulosity in the Mormon church, and just explaining how we experience, we experience the church very differently from other people. And what she said in there just resonated with me so much. And that was very, very helpful for me. And
so it's a good book.
Navigate that.
You recommend it.
Yeah. And she at the time she wrote this book anyways, she was able to get through her OCD and scrupulosity enough and stay an active member of the church and everything. Which I think is great. I ended up leaving.
But before you talk about that, can I ask you a question? Just a little bit more about the treatment. So you say CBT, which stands for cognitive behavioral therapy. People won't understand maybe what that means or what that looks like. So can you just talk a little bit more about how your therapist applied CBT to your scrupulosity in a way that was helpful?
You know what? I'm not sure I know enough about it to fully give a good picture.
Fine. That's fine. So do you mind if I talk about OCD treatment really quick?
Absolutely. Go for it.
And you tell me if this applied to you or not. The gold standard treatment for obsessive compulsive disorder is the same type of treatment that is offered for phobias, which is called exposure therapy. And basically exposure therapy is you do an assessment, you figure out what their intrusive thoughts are, and then you figure out what their compulsions are, and you help work with your client so that they can recognize their obsessive thoughts, they can recognize their intrusive thoughts, learn to sit with them, learn to allow them to happen while not trying to avoid or engage in the compulsive behaviors. And in that way, it's exposure. So you're instead of trying to avoid your intrusive thoughts by engaging in the compulsive behavior, you allow your intrusive thoughts to be there, learn to sit with them, learn to ride them out without engaging in the neutralizing compulsive behaviors. And in that way, you reverse the cycle of constantly feeding the intrusive thoughts by engaging in the avoidant compulsive behaviors. And so what that would mean for someone who feels like their hands are dirty would be not washing their hands when they want to. If it's someone who wants to check the doors or flip the switches, it's learning to not flip the switches or check the doors. And for someone who has scrupulosity, then it would mean that if they have the compulsion to confess or they have the inclination to ruminate around the thoughts or obsess about them, that they practice not confessing, not hyper praying, not hyper going to the temple, or even allowing an unsavory thought to be in their mind, but not to try and act in any way like prayer or sing a hymn or whatever that might neutralize it. Now, I have no idea whether that has anything to do with what your treatment was like, but that would be the treatment that I would be most familiar with, for something like scrupulosity in a religious context.
I think a little bit for sure. I will say at that point in my life, I had the OCD had kind of resurfaced in a different area of my life. And so while I did still deal with scrupulosity, I think the height of that was when I was, 18, 19, versus at that point, several years later. So I was dealing with it a little bit differently, I guess. And so, I think that was used a little bit for sure, to an extent. But
yeah. Well, and that's fine if you were able to get better without all of that. I will say there's a phenomenal OCD treatment clinic around Bountiful here in Utah, that actually a close family member of mine attended. It's called the OCD Anxiety Treatment Center. And it follows kind of the gold standard of OCD treatment here in Utah. So and there's no paid endorsement here. It's called the OCD and Anxiety Treatment Center.com. It's here in Utah. And because I know these sorts of things, because I've dealt with it in a professional context, and I have a psychology PhD, I can just tell you this is a great clinic. It's helped people close to me. And if you or someone you love is struggling with OCD in Utah, check it out. It will be very, very helpful.
Yeah. Another thing I wanted to mention too, this just came to mind. Well, I did some workbooks because I don't know, that stuff resonates with me, and maybe it won't for other people, but it's called the Mindfulness Workbook for OCD, and it discusses all the different types of it. It teaches you how to recognize these patterns when they're resurfacing in different areas of your life, because I was very afraid of that when I moved out to Virginia, because for me, it's usually with a major life event that the OCD will maybe resurface in another area. And so I've just been, in my spare time, if I have any, there's not a lot, but I still work through these things so I can write down my thoughts and pay attention to those. So yeah, it is a constant thing, but I've gotten to the point for sure where I can recognize those thought patterns when they're happening versus being stuck in the cycle for a long time before that. So yeah, workbooks are really helpful as well.
Yeah, and I'll add that the form of treatment that I was trained in to treat obsessive compulsive disorder is called acceptance and commitment therapy, or ACT. And there's a heavy, almost secular Buddhist component to ACT, heavy mindfulness, a heavy meditation component. And in addition to the exposure therapy of not performing the compulsions when exposed to the intrusive thoughts, it's just learning to sit with your thoughts, to accept your thoughts, to accept these thoughts that are there, to not try and fight them, to not try and make them go away, to even accept that you're feeling these intense compulsive feelings, and then focusing on what type of life you want to live, and then focusing not on trying to get rid of the OCD, but on trying to not avoid the behaviors that you need to engage in to live a full and meaningful life. And if you Google Mormon Stories Scrupulosity, you'll find an entire episode where I discuss acceptance commitment therapy, or ACT, as a treatment for OCD. And I highly recommend it as a treatment. And again, I'm just tying this to your idea that this workbook had a heavy mindfulness component. ACT has a heavy mindfulness component. So
yeah, that's great. I love it. And yeah, that being said, different treatment methods work differently for different people as well. And so I guess if I were giving advice to anyone going through this, is don't be discouraged if things maybe don't work for you immediately. It takes time. Like I said, I was in therapy for 3 years. And finally, by the end, I felt like I got to a point where I could kind of start to work through this a little bit better. So just want to put that out there as well. So